Wow, here we are again, Brother Peter, with tidbits from the Word. You remember in our last excerpt when we came up to Jacob, where Jacob wrestled with God, and God had pulled his joint, his socket, out of his thigh of his leg, and he limped after that, and everybody knew wherever he went or came from after that who he was, and he was called the supplanter. Jacob was. You remember how he worked things out in his own mind and heart without God's Son. Many of the people that God chose in the Bible failed to continue and in God's presence. They were always in his presence, but with his guidance. And so they had decided not to do that sometime. So here's Jacob. He married Leah, and Laban's daughter. And Laban tricks him, and he ends up with both of his daughters. And Rebekah is the one that he really wanted. But during the time of raising some children out of Laban's daughters, he had Reuben. Now, Reuben was the leader of the pack. When you come to the 12 tribes of Israel, Reuben was the leader of the pack. And then he had Simeon, and then Levi, and Judah, Issachar, and Zerubbabel. Now, out of one of the daughters of Laban, which was Leah, came one girl, Diana. She was the only girl. She was the 13th child, the one that made 13 children. She had 11 brothers. And those brothers were Gad and Asher, and I just read the first 8 of them. And then we had Joseph and Benjamin, and then we had Dan and Naphtali. And each one of these were tribes. Now, Bilhah was the servant of Rachel, and Bilhah was in that day, Rachel gives her servant Bilhah to her husband and says, have a child by her. And she did. He did. He had 2 of the children of Israel that were leaders in Israel. He had 2 of the children chosen by God. You say, how could this be? God knows what he's doing. We don't know bloodlines. We don't know things. There's many things we don't know. We don't know how these boys were chosen. They were chosen before they were born to be what they were going to be. Even though some of them looked like rascals, they were still necessary that they had to be in there. So when Abraham left Haran and traveled all the way down to Beersheba, Jacob's journey was the same. Jacob left Haran and came all the way down to, or he went all the way to Haran, from Jacob's journey to Haran. Okay, let's get it right. He left to Beersheba, passed by Jerusalem, and came to Haran, 450 miles, and had these children that God was going to take and run them through the wilderness and use them. And so 13 children Jacob had in that came from 4 different mothers. And how did that work? Well, that worked because in that day, God allowed a man to have children by other women. He had a plan for these 12 tribes. Now, believe it or not, you can go back to the mother of each group of boys, where there was 2 in one group and 8 in one group and 4 in one group, and go back and see how they lived. They were different. And it's amazing that my family has 6 children. I'm a brother of 4 brothers and 2 sisters. And we're different. We're all different. Why? We're in different parts of the country. And I have relatives that live in Arizona, been there quite a while. They are actually Arizonians. If I went out there, I know nothing about the Indian culture or how to live or anything, even though they're my close relatives out there. And even nearby me, I have 6 children, 5 children, and they all 5 are much different in many ways. They're different in many ways. And completely different. In any way you'd say, somebody would say, is that his brother? And they say, yeah, that's his brother. That's my other son. Well, I never would have believed it. I never would have guessed it. They're 100% different, and they are. They're 100% different. And God chose 12 men out of somebody, and they're different. Just how long that their consciences troubled them when Jacob and Esau had a little contention, and they went each one went one way and one went the other way, and God blessed both of them. He blessed both of them so that when one was sending a 250 to 450 animals and servants over there to his brother, when they got there, he said, I don't want them. I got so many, I don't know what to do with them. I got more than he's got. So God had blessed both of them on 2 different sides of the river, 2 different sides, 2 different ways of life, and God had blessed both of them with such a great thing. Genesis chapter 37 and 39, all the way up to chapters 44, we see the overview and the subject and the life of Joseph, part 1. Now remember, Joseph was used of God, and he was a godly line, not of an evil conscience or an evil way. He was perfect in all ways, and his brother now was considered evil in some ways. Then some of the evils that happened to Joseph were directly involved through the other guys that were on the earth at that time. So he's sold into slavery because of his prophecy. What was his prophecy? He told his brothers that one day he saw them kneeling down at him. That was, he could see all the way into Egypt some 30, 40 years later. But he couldn't see the trek of life he was going to take. So, let's look at them. He was cast into prison because of his purity. And he said to his brothers when he did meet them some 30 years later, he said, you meant it for evil, and God meant it for good. So his elevation, coming out of where he came out, he had been in the jail, and now he's the head guy in Egypt. He is up there. Pharaoh stepped down and said, here, you take my throne. You're wiser than I am. You're a wise man. So his explanation in Egypt by the Pharaoh. And then he sent his saints. We see saints and sinners. We see Jacob, Joseph, Reuben, Judah, Simeon, Benjamin, Potiphar's wife, the butler, and the baker. All of these people are people that played a role in his life. It'd be kind of like you walking, or I walking. For instance, when I went to school, one of the schools I went to when I was young was about 8 miles from the house. I had this girlfriend. She lived a couple miles the other way on the school, made it 10 miles. Well, I'd ride with her home on the bus, build a fire in her furnace and everything, and then turn around and walk 10 miles home. And in those days, it didn't seem very much to walk 10 miles. So 10 miles wasn't much to me at all. Matter of fact, I could trot it, and I could put a pretty good gait on. I went to school, and the school I went to was some 6 miles from where I lived, and I ran to school in the morning. I jogged to school in the morning across the granite ledges and jogged over to the school. And I was the first guy then built the fire. So God uses people to do different things in different ways, and he empowers those people. And he empowered Joseph to be the man that he was. Let's look at some Old Testament verses here. He sent a man before them, even Joseph, who was sold for a servant, whose feet they hurt with fetters. He was laid in iron until the time that his word came, and the word of the Lord tried him. The king sent and loosed him, given the ruler of the people, and let him go free. He made him lord over his house and ruler of all his substance. Psalm 105, 17 through 21. This is one beautiful psalm. You need to study Psalm 105. Find a breakdown in your Bible and study it. New Testament verses. The patriots moved with envy. This is being spoken of those patriots back there, and with envy, sold Joseph into Egypt. But God was with him and delivered him out of all his affliction and gave him favor and wisdom in the sight of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and made him governor over Egypt and all his house. Acts 7, 9 through 10. Now, we see that the New Testament backs up what the Old Testament said and did. And this God always has an answer for everything in the Bible. Everything you read in the Bible, you can go back and find its beginning. Find out where it went right and where it went wrong. Why it went right and why it went wrong. And you can find out those things. You and I, and the life that we live, if you look at it, you will find that back through your life, and I can show you the stepping stones of men that I had in my life. I have, for instance, right here in front of me, and I mentioned this before, my Uncle Russie. My Uncle Russie was a man that when I first married, called me in and counseled me. Said, sent word to me and said, you tell Pete I'd like to see him. Tell him to come down by. And I went down and I stopped at his house. And he said, I don't just understand that you have been driving like you've been driving, but you've come through here doing 70, 80 miles an hour by this house. And this is a 20-mile-an-hour zone here. And that hill up there, one of these days is going to get you and kill you. And he said, I need to speak to you about that. I need to caution you. And I'm going to caution you about that. And he did. He cautioned me. He's in heaven now, my uncle is. But he watched out for me. He watched over me. But what is an oddity in a sense of the word is I have my uncle and 5 generations of his family. 5 generations of my mother's family. All the way back to her great-grandmother, her grandmother, my grandmother, which was her mother, and my mother, and down through. There's 5 generations in this picture. And my Uncle Russie married my mother's sister. And my father's in here. Now, my father's generation, I only knew 3 of his generation. I can only go back 3 deep. But I have pictures of them 5 deep, back to great-great-grandmother. And so this is how Joseph and Jacob and all of the tribes of Israel came about. Now God saw fit to establish their names in his Bible, in his book, and the whereabouts of them and what he used them for and what to do with them, and established that for you and I, that we could find ourselves in one of those 12 guys, 13 altogether with Dinah for the ladies, and could find your way there. And so it was a different age and a different era than it is now. Their customs were different. Remember, Joseph established Potiphar's house in chapter 1 and verse 6 that in Genesis 5. And so, and he was put into Potiphar's house. How was he moved out of there? Potiphar's wife wanted to seduce him. And so she lied about him and he got put in jail. That was a plan of God. You say, would God cause that or allow that? Yes. God had a plan. And to work that plan, he put Joseph in the jailhouse for safekeeping. He knew he's in the jailhouse, he's safe. Nobody can get to him and kill him or whatever. And he's going to win all of those in the jail to God. And he's going to have meetings every day. And he's not going to have any problems in that sense of the word. So he was removed from Potiphar's house by being put in the prison. And chapter 40, Joseph was delivered from prison. And he may have thought that God had forgotten him, but God was with him all the time and was working to bring him to a place of exhortation. And that's where God brought him. He had to wait for the exact moment when God gave that Pharaoh that dream and nobody could answer it. And Pharaoh was going to kill everybody. Anybody who couldn't answer it, he was going to kill them that he asked. If they couldn't answer it, he was going to kill them. All of the soothsayers and everybody. And then finally one came to him and said, hey, when I was in prison, there was a guy there named Joseph could interpret dreams. Send for him and he will interpret your dream. And he did. And this was the stepping stone, if you please, this was the platform for Joseph to come up before the Pharaoh and end up taking over the whole throne, the whole place, running the whole gambit of Egypt, and the head guy, being the head guy. And when the great famine came, he knew how to handle it. He knew what to do. And he made it work. So the only people on the known earth in that area, for thousands of miles around that area, the only people that had any food was the Egyptians. Why? Because Joseph told them how to do it. And they did exactly what Joseph said to do. And he had the food to last for those years of famine. Now, all of this worked through the providence of God. You say, what is providence? Providence is the pre-existing knowledge. God had the pre-existing knowledge and the forethought that he put on Joseph and put on the Egyptian guy, and all of that happened was all foreknowledge to God. It was not anything new to God. It was nothing new. He narrated it. God narrated it. By the way, God is narrating your life. You can destroy your life. You can, through disobedience, destroy your life. I should have been dead a dozen times. I tempted God to kill me, and he wouldn't, because he wanted me here for this day. He has kept me in workable condition. I'm 78 and still can work every day. I worked 8 hours today, came home, built a fire, got the furnace going, worked on the furnace, and came in and got the machine out here and got started and got going here. And so Joseph's life, right now we see Jacob and Joseph, and as we go on we're going to see Joseph and Potiphar. And then that was in Potiphar. And then Joseph in his final years. We're going to look at that in a few minutes. We're going to skip Joseph and his Potiphar. Read that story of how when he was in Potiphar's house, Potiphar just made him the king of the house. He was the king of the house. And he had to tell that old hussy woman when she wanted to lay with him, hey, your master has given me everything he owns but you. You belong to him, and I cannot touch you no matter what. And she grabbed his robe and pulled it off from him, and he had to flee from there with his nearly naked. And she calls and summons the guards and lies to them and says, he has left his robe here. He tried to seduce me. It was just the opposite. I would hate to think of the place in hell that woman is because of her actions. You say she may not be in hell. She might not be. But if she is, that's going to be one big count against her. But if she got saved before she died, did whatever you have to do of the Old Testament to escape hell, and she did that, then she's okay. So we're going to look at part 2 of Joseph's life in a little bit here. That's the final years in chapter 45 through 50. The last 5 chapters of the book of Genesis is going to tell us the story of Joseph's life. We will see you next time. Right. This is Brother Peter saying bye-bye for now. Right. Bye-bye.